You're standing in a small stone room somewhere in central China. It's around 850 AD. Incense smoke hangs near the low ceiling, curling around jars of mineral powder stacked against the wall. An old alchemist crouches over a stone mortar, grinding three substances together, one chalky white, one waxy yellow, one black as soot. He's not trying to build a weapon. He's trying to live forever. That's the entire job description of a Taoist alchemist in Tang Dynasty China. Find the formula that stops the body from aging, the elixir the emperors keep paying fortunes for. The mixture in his mortar catches. It hisses. It flares and explodes in his face, singeing his eyebrows down to nothing and scorching a black mark into the floorboards. Nobody in that room thinks, even for a second, that this small kitchen disaster will end up deciding the fate of empires, redrawing borders, and outliving every dynasty that comes after it. And yet, here we are. Here's what you probably assume. Guns are a modern thing. Muskets, cowboys, trench warfare was maybe a few hundred years old, invented by some clever European engineer with steel, gears, and ambition. Except that's wrong on almost every level you can name. The discovery underneath every gun ever fired wasn't made by a weapons designer at all. It wasn't made by a soldier, a general, or a king. It was an accident made by monks and mystics chasing immortality, not murder. And getting from that scorched eyebrow in a Tang Dynasty workshop to a rifle sitting in a modern gun case took at least 5 separate world-bending turns of history, and every single one of them is stranger than the last. Here's where we have to rewind. Not centuries, but hundreds of thousands of years to a time before gunpowder was even a rumor. Now let's talk about the part of this story that never makes it into the movies. Guns didn't start the arms race. They're just the newest chapter in one that's been running since long before Homo sapiens existed. Archaeologists working at Schöningen in Germany uncovered wooden spears roughly 300,000 years old, sharpened, balanced, tapered exactly where a modern javelin is tapered, clearly built by hands that understood aerodynamics long before anyone had a word for it. That's not a metaphor. That's engineering, done by a species that hadn't invented agriculture yet. Then, tens of thousands of years later, something changes again. At Sibidu Cave in South Africa, archaeologist Marlies Lombard and her colleagues examined microscopic fracture patterns and impact damage on ancient stone points, and found evidence for bow and arrow use dating back roughly 64,000 years. A 2010 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science. That's not a small upgrade. That's a completely different philosophy of violence, distance. Killing from further away with less risk to your own body. Think about that pattern for a second. Spear, then bow, then thousands of years later, the atlatl, a spear thrower found in France dating back over 17,000 years, capable of launching a dart with roughly twice the force of a bare arm. Each invention does the exact same job. Put more distance, more force, and more safety between you and the thing that could kill you. Not one great leap, a long, slow relay race. Guns aren't a break from this story. They're the punchline. Here's something that almost never comes up in these conversations. Gunpowder wasn't invented. It was stumbled into by people who were actively trying to do something else entirely. Taoist alchemists in Tang Dynasty China spent enormous energy mixing minerals, metals, and organic compounds in search of a formula that would halt the aging process, sometimes with royal funding attached. A surviving text from around 850 AD, the Zhenyuan Maodao Yaoluya, contains something that reads remarkably like a modern warning label. It describes a batch of ingredients, including sulfur and saltpeter, that had been mixed together, caught fire, burned the hands and faces of the alchemist involved, and burned the house down around them. This isn't some obscure footnote either. British sinologist Joseph Needham devoted entire volumes of his monumental science and civilization in China to tracing exactly this kind of early record, treating it as one of the clearest documented origin points of gunpowder anywhere in the historical literature. Here's the thing, nobody in that room was trying to invent a weapon. They were trying to cheat death, and instead they created one of history's most efficient tools for causing it, not on purpose. By accident in pursuit of the exact opposite goal. There's something almost poetic about that, and also deeply, deeply on brand for human history. Now here's where it stops being a curiosity and starts being a weapon. For roughly a century and a half after that first documented accident, gunpowder's main career was in fireworks and signal flares. Spectacle, not slaughter. That starts changing by 1044 AD, when a Song Dynasty military compendium called the Wujing Zongyao, compiled by scholar official Zheng Gongliang, records that specific gunpowder mixtures were being formulated for actual warfare, including incendiary bombs, designed to be hurled by catapult over city walls. Then comes the real leap. During the Songjin Wars, Chinese forces developed what historians call thunderclap bombs, iron-cased gunpowder shells used at the siege of Kaifeng in 1232, and separately something called the fire lance, a tube packed with gunpowder strapped to the end of a spear that shoots flame and shrapnel directly into an approaching enemy. Records place fire lances in active combat by 1132 AD. At the siege of the city of Dian, look at that object for a second. It's not a cannon, it's not a rifle, it's a spear that breathes fire, a hybrid, half-old weapon and half the new chemistry. And that hybrid is the direct ancestor of every gun that came after it. Not a clean invention, a slow mutation tested in real battles, refined by trial and very literal error. Let me throw something at you that might sound wild. For roughly 200 years after guns finally reach 100 years after guns finally reach Europe, bows are often still the better weapon, faster to reload, more accurate at range, more reliable in wet weather when a gun's burning match can simply go out. So why did anyone bother switching at all? Here's the uncomfortable answer. It wasn't about performance. It was about training time. When researchers studied skeletons recovered from the wreck of the Mary Rose, an English warship that sank in 1545 and was raised from the seabed centuries later, they found something striking in the remains of the archers on board. Bone spurs on the shoulders and wrists, and skeletal asymmetry between the left and right arm. Permanent physical deformations built up from years, sometimes a decade or more, of drawing heavy warbows that could require well over 100 pounds of pull. A longbowman wasn't just trained, he was physically rebuilt by his own weapon, starting in childhood. A soldier handed an early firearm, by contrast, could be made minimally useful within a few weeks. Not skill, numbers. A king didn't need a small, expensive elite of physically extraordinary archers anymore. He needed a large, replaceable, quickly trained army that could be assembled the same season it was needed. That single economic fact, more than any single explosion, is what actually tipped the scale toward gunpowder over the following 2 centuries. Now let's tackle the biggest myth about who actually invented guns, because Hollywood and most Western textbooks have spent decades getting this completely wrong. The myth: guns are a European invention. Clever engineers in Renaissance workshops dreaming up cannons and muskets from scratch, out of nowhere, through sheer ingenuity. In reality, the earliest confirmed gun anywhere in the world is Chinese. A bronze hand cannon discovered in Acheng, in China's Heilongjiang province, has been dated to around 1288 AD. A fully formed, tube-shaped firearm capable of launching a projectile using gunpowder, complete with a touch hole for ignition. That's decades before Europe even draws a picture of one. The earliest known European illustration of a cannon doesn't appear until 1326, in a manuscript by Walter de Millemete, showing a strange vase-shaped device firing what looks like an oversized crossbow bolt. The technology didn't spring up twice, independently on opposite sides of the planet. It traveled, carried west along Silk Road trade networks, and through the enormous interconnected Mongol Empire, which by the 13th century stretched from the Pacific coast to the edges of Eastern Europe, moving people, goods, and knowledge across a single continuous corridor of contact. Not invention, transmission. The gun is a Chinese idea that Europe inherited, refined obsessively over several centuries, and, eventually, exported back out to the rest of the world with consequences nobody in that first stone room could have imagined. Let's be honest about something, because this would be seriously misleading if it wasn't addressed directly. Guns did not sweep across the battlefield and instantly make older weapons obsolete. That's the movie version. The real version is slower, clumsier, and takes centuries to finish playing out. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, gunpowder weapons barely register at all. The battle is decided overwhelmingly by English longbowmen cutting down French knights in the mud. Early hand cannons required a soldier to physically press a burning cord to a small hole in the barrel, hope the powder inside was still dry, and pray the barrel itself didn't crack open in his hands. Reload times could stretch past a full minute. A sudden rainstorm could turn an entire company of gunners into men holding expensive, useless metal tubes. It isn't until the early 1600s, with the development of reliable flintlock mechanisms, often credited to French gunsmith Morin le Bourgeois around 1610, that firearms finally become fast and dependable enough to fully replace the bow across European battlefields. Historian Kelly DeVries, who has spent much of his career studying medieval gunpowder weaponry, has argued that early guns succeeded less because they outperformed older weapons and more because they were simply cheaper to mass produce at scale. So no, gunpowder didn't win overnight. It won slowly, awkwardly, unevenly, over roughly 300 years, which somehow makes the whole story more human, not less. Now let's talk about the part that actually rewired human civilization, not just the battlefield. For close to 1,000 years, European power rested on two things: heavily armored knights, bred and trained from childhood for a single purpose, and stone castles that could withstand almost anything short of a lengthy siege. Guns broke both at roughly the same time. In 1453, the Ottoman army laid siege to Constantinople using a massive bombard designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a cannon so large it reportedly required 60 oxen to move it into position. It breached the Theodosian walls, fortifications that had successfully protected the city for well over 1,000 years, in a matter of weeks. A cannonball doesn't care about your bloodline. It doesn't care how many generations of nobility trained you from age 7 to hold a lance correctly. That's the real revolution. Not the explosion itself, but what the explosion did to hierarchy. Building and supplying gunpowder weapons required money, metalworking infrastructure, and centralized organization. Resources that only kings and states, not scattered individual lords, could reliably provide. Historians, including Michael Roberts and later Jeffrey Parker, have described the resulting shift as a military revolution, and other scholars use the term gunpowder empires for the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal states that rose to dominance largely on the back of exactly this technology. Feudal power, built on decentralized local warlords, started collapsing into something new: centralized nation-states with standing armies and something no small lord had ever held before: a monopoly on organized violence. Think about the object sitting somewhere in your own city right now, behind a counter in a locked case in someone's home. It traces back, in an unbroken line of accident and adaptation, to a monk in a stone room who wasn't trying to hurt anyone at all. That's the part worth sitting with. Every distance weapon humans have ever built, the spear, the bow, the atlatl, the fire lance, the gun, follows the exact same underlying shape. It's not really about violence, not at its root. It's about fear, and about closing the gap between what a human body can physically do and what a human mind can imagine doing to another person from further and further away. We keep inventing new ways to act at a distance from the consequences of acting. And here's the uncomfortable part. Once that gap opens, it doesn't close again. It just gets filled by whoever manages to build the next version a little faster than everyone else. That was true with bronze-tipped spears. It was true with the longbow. It was true with the flintlock. And it's true in a very different form, with the technologies being built right now in labs that look nothing like a smoky room in Tang Dynasty China, but are chasing the exact same underlying instinct. You already live inside the end result of that pattern, whether you notice it or not. It's in the laws that decide who can legally own what. It's in the shape of modern nations, built out of the ashes of collapsed feudal orders that guns helped bring down. It's in the entire architecture of centralized state power that grew up specifically because gunpowder made the old, scattered version of power obsolete. None of that was designed in advance by anyone. It emerged, one accident, one adaptation, one desperate battlefield improvisation at a time. the exact same way it started, in that smoky room, in front of a mortar and pestle that was never supposed to be a weapon. The alchemist wasn't looking for a weapon. He was looking for eternity. He found the opposite, and it changed everything anyway.